My name is Aurora Vance, and for 5 years, I was my mother's world. That's not a boast. It's a statement of fact, as unadorned and heavy as a block of granite. For 1,825 days, I was the first person she saw in the morning and the last voice she heard at night. I bathed her, I fed her, and I managed a constellation of doctors' visits that would have confounded an air traffic controller. While I was doing this, my brother Mason sent a gourmet fruit basket for Christmas and called it doing his part. When Mom passed, my family, which really just meant Mason and his perpetually unimpressed wife, Chloe, expected me to grieve quietly, to fade back into the wallpaper of their lives. While Mason inherited half of the estate he'd done nothing to preserve. But my mother, Eleanor, had one last secret, one final entry in a ledger no one knew she was keeping. At the will reading, just when I thought the final humiliation was at hand, the lawyer presented a second document. It was Mom's private journal, a thick, leather-bound book she'd titled The Caregiver's Ledger. It detailed every hour of my work, every dollar I spent out of my own pocket, and assigned it a cold, hard, professional rate. Her final wish, her last act of a quiet, fiercely protective love, was that my salary be paid from the estate before it was split. A salary that would leave Mason with almost nothing but the budget for next year's fruit basket. Before I tell you how that single, leather-bound book became the most powerful weapon in a war I never even knew I was fighting, I want to hear from you. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It helps me feel connected to all of you, knowing we're sharing this space together. And if you've ever felt overlooked or had your sacrifices taken for granted by the very people who should have seen you most clearly, hit that like button. It's a small way of telling the world that we see each other. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. This is a community for people who know that sometimes the quietest voices have the most powerful stories to tell. The beginning of the end started not with a bang, but with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. I was 34, living in a small but sunny apartment downtown, and my graphic design business was finally, after years of ramen noodle dinners and relentless networking, starting to feel real. I had landed a contract with a local brewery, and I was sketching out label designs, lost in a world of hops and serifs, when my phone buzzed with the sterile, jarring ringtone I'd assigned to the hospital. On the other end, a calm, dispassionate voice informed me that my mother, Eleanor Vance, had taken a fall. The words were simple, clinical, broken hip, but I felt them like a physical blow, the shattering of bone in my own body. I was out the door in 3 minutes, leaving a half-finished logo and a lukewarm cup of coffee behind. My life, as I knew it, had just ended. I just didn't know it yet. I found my mother in a stark, beige room in the emergency ward, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. Her face, usually so composed, was pale and etched with pain. A thin, white sheet was pulled up to her chin, and she looked like a broken bird. She tried to smile when she saw me, but it was a grimace. "Oh, Rory," she whispered, her voice thin as thread. I was just reaching for the tea. It was such a simple, domestic act, and it had resulted in this catastrophe. I took her hand, its skin as soft and papery as old parchment, and squeezed. "It's okay, Mom. I'm here now." And I was, but my brother, Mason, was not. I called him from the hallway, the antiseptic smell of the hospital filling my lungs. He answered on the third ring, his voice breezy and distant. "Hey, Ro, what's up? I'm in the middle of something huge here. Here was a golf resort in Arizona for what he called a critical networking conference. When I told him about Mom, there was a pause. Not a pause of shock or concern, but the kind of pause you make when your dinner reservation is interrupted. A broken hip? Oh man, that's rough. Is she okay? The question was a formality, a box to be checked. I explained the situation, the need for surgery, the long recovery ahead. Right, he said, his voice already distracted. I could hear the clink of ice in a glass, the murmur of voices in the background. Listen, I can't just drop everything. This is the big one. I'll wrap things up here as fast as I can and try to get a flight out tomorrow. You've got it handled for now, right? You're the best, Ro. A real lifesaver. He hung up before I could answer, before I could scream that no, I did not have it handled. Mason arrived 36 hours later, smelling of airport lounges and self-importance. He breezed into Mom's new room on the orthopedic floor with a bouquet of overpriced lilies that made her sneeze and a box of chocolates she wasn't allowed to eat. He kissed her on the forehead, told her she was a tough old bird, and then immediately steered me down to the hospital cafeteria for what he called a family meeting. The cafeteria was a soul-crushing place, smelling of stale coffee and disinfectant. We sat at a small Formica table under the buzzing fluorescent lights. Mason didn't even buy a coffee. He got straight to the point, arranging our family's future as if he were delegating tasks to an underling. Okay, he began, leaning forward with an air of magnanimous authority. I've been thinking. You work from home, Aurora. Your schedule is flexible. It just makes the most sense for you to move in with Mom for a little while, just until she's back on her feet. I stared at him, my lukewarm tea forgotten in my hands. Move in? Mason, I have a business. I have clients, deadlines. He waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a fly. That design stuff? It's a great hobby, Ro, really. But this is Mom. This is family. Family has to come first, you know? The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so certain of his own logic, made my protest die in my throat. He was framing my career, the thing I had poured my soul into, as a frivolous pastime that could be paused at will. I'll handle the big picture, he continued, puffing out his chest. I'll manage her portfolio, deal with the insurance stuff from a distance. You'll be on the ground, handling the day-to-day. We'll be a team. It was a masterclass in manipulation. He was making it sound like a partnership, a fair division of labor, when in reality, he was handing me a life sentence and calling it a temporary assignment. I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream that my life was just as important as his, that my business wasn't a hobby. But looking at his confident, expectant face, all the fight went out of me. It was the dynamic we'd had since childhood. Mason was the golden boy, the one destined for success, the one whose time was valuable. I was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who was always expected to accommodate. A part of me, a small, foolish part, still yearned for his approval, for him to see me as an equal. So, with a heart full of stones, I heard myself say, "Okay, Mason. For Mom, I'll do it." He smiled, a broad, relieved grin. I knew I could count on you, Ro. You're a saint. He stood up. The meeting concluded. He had a flight back to his real life in 3 hours. My new life was just beginning. The first year was a blur of exhaustion and quiet resentment. I packed up my sunny apartment, putting my life into cardboard boxes, and moved back into my childhood bedroom. The wallpaper, a pattern of faded yellow roses, was the same. The room felt smaller, like a cage. My life became a relentless cycle of tasks. Waking up at dawn to the chime of the pill dispenser, crushing tablets into applesauce because Mom had trouble swallowing, helping her navigate the treacherous few feet from her bed to the commode, my arms straining under her weight. The physical toll was immediate. My back ached constantly. My hands were dry and cracked from endless washing. But the emotional toll was a slower, more insidious poison. My business withered on the vine. I tried to keep up at first, working late into the night after Mom was asleep, my laptop glowing in the dark. But my clients needed meetings, calls, attention I could no longer give. One by one, they dropped away, sending polite, regretful emails. The brewery, my prized account, found another designer. I felt it like a death. My social life evaporated. Friends would call, their voices bright with invitations for dinner or a movie. "I can't," I'd say, my voice flat. "Mom's not feeling well." After a while, the calls became less frequent, and then they stopped altogether. My world shrank to the four walls of that house. There were nights that broke me. I remember one, about 6 months in, when Mom had a bad reaction to a new medication. I was woken at 3 a.m. by a retching sound. I ran to her room to find her disoriented and sick, vomit soiling the sheets and her nightgown. There was no anger, no disgust in me, just a deep, bone-weary sadness. I cleaned her up with a gentleness I didn't know I possessed, stripping the bed, sponging her face with a cool cloth. She was crying, humiliated. "I'm so sorry, Rory. I'm so sorry." I held her hand, stroking her hair. "It's okay, Mom. We're okay." I sat in the chair by her bed until the sun came up, just to make sure she was breathing. I tried to talk to Mason about it, to make him understand the reality of what I was doing. I called him the next day, my voice shaky with fatigue. "It was a really rough night, Mace." I started to explain about the medication, the cleanup. He cut me off. "Yeah, that sounds tough. Hey, listen, did you see the market today? My tech stocks are on fire, and you'll never guess who I played around with yesterday." He launched into a story about some C-level executive, his voice buzzing with excitement. He hadn't heard a word I said. He didn't want to. My reality was messy and unpleasant. It was a smudge on the clean, successful portrait of his own life. That first Christmas set the pattern for the years to come. 2 days before Christmas, a large wicker basket arrived from an expensive online retailer. It was filled with perfect, waxy-looking fruit, the kind that looks better than it tastes. Tucked inside was a generic card with a printed greeting, "Wishing you a joyful holiday season." It was signed, in a stranger's looping script, Mason and Chloe. When Mason called on Christmas morning, he was full of bonhomie. "Did you get the basket?" Chloe picked it out. "We wanted to make sure you guys had something special. We're doing our part, you know, covering the gift giving." I looked at the basket, sitting on the kitchen counter like a monument to his detachment. I had been up since 5 a.m., had cooked a small turkey, had helped Mom get dressed, had wrapped the few presents I'd managed to buy online. And he thought this basket, this soulless, outsourced gesture, was doing his part. That was the moment I understood. He wasn't just detached. He was in a different reality altogether. My mother was a quiet woman, but she was not unseeing. From the confines of her bed, and later her favorite armchair, she watched my world shrink as hers did. She saw the dark circles under my eyes, the way my shoulders stooped with fatigue. She saw the polite, pained smile I wore like a mask, and she saw the glaring absence of her son. She heard his perfunctory phone calls, 5 minutes of him talking about his successes, ending with a breezy, "Well, give my love to Mom," as if she were an afterthought in her own life. One evening, she watched me fall asleep in the chair beside her bed, my sketchbook open on my lap to a blank page. I hadn't drawn anything for myself in months. A look of profound sadness, mixed with a steely resolve, settled on her face. Later that night, after I had helped her to bed and gone to my own, she did something. She reached for the book on her nightstand. It was a beautiful, leather-bound journal that I had given her years ago for her birthday, thinking she might write down her memories. She had never used it. Until now, my mother, Eleanor Vance, had been a bookkeeper for a small, family-owned hardware store for 40 years. She understood numbers. She understood fairness. She believed in ledgers, in balancing accounts, in everything having its proper place and its proper value. She opened the journal, its pages crisp and empty. She uncapped her favorite fountain pen, and she made the first entry, not as a doting mother writing in a diary, but as the meticulous bookkeeper she had always been. The heading was simple: Caregiver's Ledger, Year 1. The first entry read, September 5th, Aurora moved home. Gave up apartment, rent approximately $1,200 per month, and business, estimated income loss $40,000 per year, to provide full-time care. No compensation. Beneath it, another entry. October 14th. Purchased and installed 3 grab bars for bathroom. Cost $89.45. Paid by A. Vance from personal funds. She was not just writing down her feelings. She was keeping accounts. It was her secret, her last project, a quiet, methodical rebellion against the injustice she saw unfolding every single day. She was building a case, entry by entry, for the true value of a daughter's love. The next few years settled into a monotonous, grinding rhythm. The temporary arrangement became my permanent reality. Mom's health was a pendulum, swinging between periods of relative stability and sudden, terrifying declines. There were late-night trips to the emergency room for urinary tract infections that left her delirious, a bout of pneumonia that nearly took her, in the slow, inexorable march of arthritis that stiffened her joints until every movement was an agony. Through it all, I was the constant. I learned to read the subtle signs of an impending crisis, the way she'd refuse her morning tea or the slight tremor in her hands. I became an expert in her medication, a fierce advocate in doctors' offices, correcting residents who hadn't bothered to read her chart properly. My isolation became absolute. The world outside the house felt like a foreign country. I watched my old friends' lives unfold on social media, a series of bright, happy squares I could no longer access. They got married, had babies, traveled to Thailand and Italy. I saw pictures of Mason and Chloe in Paris, smiling in front of the Eiffel Tower. Chloe posted a photo of a lavish dinner, captioning it, "My hard-working husband deserves a break." I was looking at it on my phone at 3 a.m, while I sat by Mom's bed, listening to the wheeze in her breath and praying it wouldn't get worse. That night, I remember a profound and lonely bitterness settling in my heart. It wasn't just that he was on vacation. It was that he felt he deserved it, while I apparently deserved this. The weekly phone calls from Mason became a form of exquisite torture. They were always on Sunday evenings, a box-checking exercise before his week began. "Hey, Ro, how's things?" he'd ask, the question a prelude to his own monologue. He'd talk about a promotion, a new car, a problem with his landscaper. He'd ask about Mom as a cursory sign-off. "Mom doing okay?" "Good, good. Tell her I love her." I started timing the calls. They never lasted more than 5 minutes. He never asked about me. Not once. He never asked if I was coping, if I needed anything, if I was okay. In his mind, I had ceased to be a person with needs. I was a function, a utility. I was Mom's caregiver, and that was the beginning and end of my identity. By the 4th year, my savings were gone. I had bled them dry on groceries, on copays, on comfortable slippers for Mom, on hiring a professional to deep clean the carpets because the dust bothered her lungs. All the small, invisible costs of maintaining a life. The house itself, while paid off, was old and required constant upkeep that Mason, the big picture, financial manager, never seemed to factor into his spreadsheets. The final straw was the wheelchair. Mom's mobility had declined to the point where the walker was no longer safe. She needed a proper, lightweight wheelchair to get to her appointments without it being a Herculean struggle. The one her insurance partially covered was heavy and cumbersome. I found a better one online, a sleek, modern model that was easier to maneuver and fold. It was expensive. Swallowing my pride, which had already been ground to a fine dust, I called Mason. I hated doing it. It felt like begging. I explained the situation, calmly and rationally, laying out the reasons why the better wheelchair was a necessity, not a luxury. His response was a sigh of exasperation. Another expense row. I just balanced the books for the quarter. He made it sound like I was a profligate teenager, asking for a bigger allowance. Are you sure you need the fancy model? I mean, Mom's not exactly running marathons in it. The standard one is probably fine. The condescension in his voice was a physical slap. He didn't see a tool to give his mother a modicum of comfort and dignity. He saw an unnecessary line item on a budget. I held my ground, my voice tight. It's about my ability to get her to her appointments without injuring myself, Mason. The standard one is 50 pounds. This one is 30. There was a long, grudging silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, "Fine, I'll transfer the money. But you really need to start watching the budget more closely. We have to think about preserving the estate." The estate. He said it as if Mom were already gone, as if the house and her savings were just a pile of money waiting for him. He made the transfer, but the victory felt like ashes in my mouth. He had made me feel small and irresponsible, a charity case asking for a handout, all for trying to provide the most basic level of care for our mother. I sat in the kitchen and cried, not for the first time, but this time the tears felt different. They were hot with a rage I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. It was around that time that Sarah came into our lives. With Mom's health in a more fragile state, her doctor had arranged for a hospice nurse to visit twice a week. I had dreaded it, imagining another clinical, detached presence in our quiet world. But Sarah was different. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with a warm, no-nonsense demeanor and eyes that missed nothing. On her first visit, she watched me help Mom from her chair to her bed, a maneuver I had perfected over the years. She watched me check her skin for pressure sores, fluff her pillows just so, and speak to her with a quiet, running commentary of encouragement. After she'd checked Mom's vitals and made her comfortable, she found me in the kitchen, staring blankly at a pile of medical bills. She put a hand on my shoulder. "You're a natural at this," she said, her voice gentle but firm. I flinched, unused to praise. "I'm just doing what I have to," I mumbled. Sarah shook her head. "Number. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know what doing what you have to looks like. This is different. The way you care for her. You're doing the work of 3 people. You know that. You're her nurse, her cook, her companion, her advocate. Your mother is so lucky to have you. Tears pricked my eyes. It was the first time in years that someone had looked past the function and seen the person. Someone had validated the sacrifice, not as an expectation, but as an extraordinary act. Sarah became my lifeline. She'd sit with me for 10 minutes after each visit, making me drink a cup of tea. She talked to me about caregiver burnout. She asked me about my old life, about my design work. She looked at my old portfolio and told me my work was beautiful. "You can't lose this part of yourself, Aurora," she'd say. "When this is over, you have to promise me you'll find your way back to it." She was planting seeds of a future I had stopped believing in, reminding me that Aurora, the daughter, and Aurora, the designer, still existed beneath the crushing weight of Aurora, the caregiver. She was the ally I never knew I needed, a quiet force of recognition in my lonely world. Unbeknownst to me, she had also become an ally to my mother. Mom would talk to her, and Sarah would listen. And one afternoon, Mom had her sign a document as an official witness. Sarah simply thought it was an update to her living will. She had no idea she was co-signing an act of posthumous justice. The final year was a long, slow goodbye. Mom was mostly bedridden, drifting in and out of lucidity. The house was quieter than ever, filled with the hum of an oxygen concentrator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My days were measured in morphine doses and the turning of my mother in her bed to prevent sores. There were moments of heartbreaking clarity. One afternoon, she woke up and her eyes were sharp and clear. The fog of her illness momentarily lifted. She looked at me, really looked at me, and her hand, frail and trembling, found mine. "You've been my world, Rory," she whispered, her voice surprisingly strong. "My whole world. Don't ever think I didn't see. I saw everything." A tear slipped from the corner of her eye and traced a path through the delicate wrinkles on her cheek. "Promise me something," she said, her grip tightening on my hand. "Promise me you'll live your life, a big, beautiful life. For you, after this is all over." I promised her, my throat thick with unshed tears. I thought it was just a mother's dying wish, a plea for her child's happiness. I had no idea it was part of a larger, more intricate plan. A few days later, in another moment of clarity, she gestured toward the nightstand. "My journal," she rasped. "My pen." I brought them to her, and with immense effort, she scribbled a few final lines, her handwriting shaky but determined. I thought she was just jotting down a stray memory. I didn't know she was signing off on the final invoice. When the end came, it was peaceful. I had called Mason, telling him the doctor said it was a matter of days, maybe hours. He protested, of course. A board meeting, a quarterly report. "Are you sure?" he'd asked, as if I might be exaggerating for effect. But he came. He arrived just 4 hours before Mom took her last breath. He sat awkwardly in a chair on the other side of the bed, checking his phone, while I held Mom's hand and murmured to her. He was there for her final, gentle exhale. It was a fluke of timing, but I knew, with a sickening certainty, that he would later rewrite this history. He would tell everyone he had rushed to her side, that he had been there with her, holding her hand, at the very end. The dutiful son. I was just numb. I felt nothing but a vast, silent emptiness. The engine of my life for the past 5 years had just stopped, and I was adrift in the sudden, terrifying silence. Which brought me here, to this suffocatingly warm conference room at the law offices of Thompson, Finch, and Associates. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, lemon polish, and my brother's expensive, obnoxious cologne. The mahogany table gleamed under a brass chandelier, reflecting our distorted faces. There was Mason, looking restless and important in his tailored suit. Beside him, his wife, Chloe, examined her flawless manicure, her expression one of profound boredom. She looked as if she were waiting for a table at a mediocre restaurant. And then there was me, in my simple black dress, feeling like a ghost at the feast. Mason had been making a show of being the bereaved, yet responsible son all week. He'd organized the funeral with a brisk, corporate efficiency, chosen the most expensive casket, and delivered a eulogy full of beautiful, hollow platitudes about the unconditional love of a wonderful mother. He'd accepted condolences with a grave, somber face, all while texting furiously on his phone during the reception. Now, in the lawyer's office, his performance continued. He leaned over and patted my hand in a gesture of magnanimous pity. "Don't worry, Ro," he whispered, his voice oozing with false concern. "I know things have been tough for you. Once this is all settled, I'll make sure you're taken care of." The implication was clear. He would inherit his half, the lion's share, and from his great height of wealth and generosity, he would deign to give me a little handout to get by. He thought he was being kind. I felt a cold, familiar knot of rage and resignation tighten in my stomach. This was it, the final indignity, to be treated as a charity case in the division of our mother's legacy, the legacy I had single-handedly preserved. Mr. Thompson, a kind-faced man in his late 60s, who had been our family's lawyer for decades, finally entered the room. He nodded at us gravely and sat at the head of the table, placing a thin file folder in front of him. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Eleanor Vance." He put on a pair of reading glasses and opened the folder. Mason leaned forward, a flicker of greedy anticipation in his eyes. Chloe sat up a little straighter, her boredom momentarily replaced by interest. Mr. Thompson began to read in a steady, formal monotone. I, Eleanor Vance, being of sound mind and body. The language was standard, full of legal jargon that washed over me. I tuned it out, my mind focused on the quiet hum of the air conditioning. I already knew what it would say. I had prepared myself for this. My mother was a fair woman, and in her mind, fair meant equal. The will would stipulate that everything be split 50-50. It was the conventional, expected thing to do. It would not account for the last 5 years. It would not account for the lost career, the sleepless nights, the endless sacrifice. It would place my 5 years of servitude on the exact same level as Mason's 5 years of neglect. Finally, Mr. Thompson reached the crucial passage. All the rest, residue and remainder of my estate, both real and personal, of whatsoever kind and wheresoever situated, I give, devise, and bequeath to be divided equally, share and share alike, between my beloved children, Aurora Vance and Mason Vance. There it was. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Mason leaned back in his chair, a slow, deeply satisfied smile spreading across his face. He caught my eye and gave me a subtle, triumphant nod, as if to say, "See, Mom was fair. She loved us both the same." In that moment, I had never felt more invisible. All my work, all my love, all my life, rendered down to a simple, clean, and utterly unjust fraction. One half, the same as his. I lowered my eyes, staring at my hands clasped in my lap, waiting for this ordeal to be over. But Mr. Thompson was not finished. He cleared his throat, a sound that seemed unusually loud in the silent room. However, he said, and the word sliced through the thick atmosphere. Mason's smile faltered. Chloe looked up from her nails. There is a second document, Mr. Thompson continued, reaching into his briefcase. A binding addendum and codicil to the will, which Eleanor instructed me to present and execute at this time. He pulled out a thick, worn, leather-bound journal and placed it on the polished table with a soft thud. It was Mom's journal, the one I'd given her. My heart gave a strange, painful lurch. "What the hell is that?" Mason blurted out, his voice sharp with suspicion. "A diary. What does a diary have to do with anything?" Mr. Thompson looked at him over the rim of his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Your mother was a very meticulous woman, Mason. She called this her caregiver's ledger." He opened the journal. The pages were filled with my mother's neat, precise script. She has left explicit instructions that certain passages be read aloud. Mason scoffed, a short, ugly sound of disbelief. But the lawyer ignored him, his eyes fixed on the page. He began to read. Entry, October 14th, Year 1, 2:15 a.m. Aurora cleaned me and the bed after a severe medication reaction. She stayed awake with me until dawn, holding my hand so I wouldn't be scared. Time logged, 3.75 hours. Service rendered, skilled nursing and emotional support. Mason's face was a mask of confusion. "What is this nonsense?" Mr. Thompson continued, his voice unwavering. Entry, December 24th, Year 1. Mason and Chloe sent a fruit basket. Cost, estimated $75. Aurora planned, shopped for, and cooked a full Christmas dinner, decorated the house, and provided 12 hours of companionship and care. Differential value ... He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. He flipped a few pages. Entry, May 12th, Year 3. Aurora paid for a new lightweight wheelchair out of her own dwindling savings, after Mason advised against the fancy model. Expense to be reimbursed, $580 plus interest. My own gasp was audible. I remembered that phone call, the humiliation of it. Mom had heard. She had heard it all. The lawyer kept reading, his voice a calm, steady drumbeat of my life for the past 5 years. He read about the late-night ER visits, the canceled appointments with my friends, the hours I spent on the phone with insurance companies. With each entry, a layer of my invisible life was being made visible. Each sacrifice tallied and honored. Mason's face had gone from confused to pale to a blotchy, furious red. Chloe looked like she had swallowed a wasp. Finally, Mr. Thompson turned to the last page. "Here is your mother's final signed entry," he said, his eyes meeting mine for a brief, compassionate moment. He read, "I have calculated the total hours of care at standard professional rates. 1,825 days of on-call supervision. 43,800 hours. I have assigned a blended rate for a home health aide, a licensed practical nurse, a cook, a cleaner, and a financial manager. I have calculated the expenses paid by Aurora from her personal funds. I have estimated her lost professional income based on her previous year's earnings, with a modest projection for growth. My final and binding directive is this. My daughter, Aurora Vance, is to be treated as the primary creditor to my estate. Her invoice for 5 years of professional service must be paid in full from all available assets before any remaining remainder is distributed as per the primary will." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Then he looked directly at Mason and delivered the final blow. "Your mother, with the help of a forensic accountant, calculated the total sum owed to Aurora. He named the figure. It was a staggering amount of money, a number that made me feel dizzy. It was a number that I knew, with sudden, brilliant clarity, comprised nearly the entire value of my mother's estate. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a dense, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breath. Mason sat frozen, his mouth slightly agape, his face the color of ash. The smug, triumphant prince had been reduced to a pauper in the space of 5 minutes. The lawyer closed the ledger. The accounts were settled. The silence was shattered by the sound of Mason's chair scraping violently against the floor as he shot to his feet. His face, which had been pale with shock, was now a mottled, furious purple. "This is a joke," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "This is completely insane. She was senile. She was out of her mind." He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes wild. You did this. You manipulated a sick old woman. You poisoned her against me, whispering in her ear for years." Chloe, her own face a mask of horrified disbelief, grabbed his arm. "Mason, calm down," she hissed. But he shook her off. He was completely unhinged, the carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated, in-control son, crumbling to reveal the spoiled child beneath. Mr. Thompson remained perfectly calm. He removed his glasses and began polishing them with a small cloth. "I assure you, Mason, your mother was anything but senile," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I met with her 3 times in the final year to finalize this document. She was sharp, lucid, and fiercely determined. Furthermore, the codicil was signed and notarized in the presence of a legally valid witness, her hospice nurse, Sarah Jenkins, who has provided a sworn affidavit as to your mother's state of mind." At the mention of Sarah, I felt a jolt. Of course, Sarah, the ally. Mom had planned this down to the last, irrefutable detail. Mason looked like he'd been physically struck. "I'll sue," he roared, his voice cracking. "I'll contest this. I'll drag this through the courts for years. You won't see a dime." He turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the heavy door behind him so hard that a painting on the wall rattled. Chloe, after giving me a look of pure venom, scurried after him. I was left alone in the silent room with Mr. Thompson. I was shaking, a fine tremor running through my entire body. I felt a strange mix of terror and elation. It was too much to process. The lawyer looked at me, his expression softening into one of deep sympathy. He pushed the leather-bound ledger across the polished table toward me. "This belongs to you now, Aurora," he said gently. "Your mother wanted you to have it. She said it was more important than the money." I reached out and touched the worn leather cover. It felt warm, alive. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my throat tight with 1,000 unsaid emotions. I drove home to the house, the ledger sitting on the passenger seat like a sacred object. The house felt different. For 5 years, it had been a place of duty, of confinement, a loving prison. Now it was just a house. It was quiet, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the lingering presence of my mother's fierce, protective love. I made a cup of tea, my hands still shaking, and sat in her favorite armchair, the one with the worn, floral pattern. I opened the ledger. For the next 2 hours, I read. I read my life, as seen through my mother's eyes. It was all there, in her neat, bookkeeper's script. Not just the big things, but the small, forgotten moments of tenderness and pain. There were entries that made me weep. November 3rd, Aurora brushed my hair for 20 minutes, because my scalp was sore. She hummed the lullaby I used to sing to her. I pretended to be asleep, but I was crying. How did I get so lucky to have a daughter like this? And there were entries that made a hot, righteous anger burn in my chest on her behalf. Sunday, 8:15 p.m. Mason called, 4 minutes 32 seconds, spoke of his new boat, did not ask a single question about my health, asked Aurora if the lawn had been mowed because it will affect the resale value of the house. She had seen it all. She had felt every slight, every moment of neglect, not just for herself, but for me. The ledger wasn't an invoice. It was a testament. It was her final, powerful way of saying, I see you. I value you. You are not invisible. The tears that streamed down my face were not tears of sadness, but of release. It was the profound, cleansing grief of finally being understood. The next morning, my phone rang. It was Sarah. I heard the news from Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice warm. I just wanted to say, your mother was one of the most remarkable women I've ever met. It was my absolute honor to be her witness. She found a way to make things right. Her words were a balm on my raw nerves, a final confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that what had happened was real. After we hung up, I stood in the middle of the living room and looked around. I saw the worn patch on the carpet where the wheelchair had sat, the faint marks on the wall from the hospital bed. For years, these had been symbols of my confinement. Now, I saw them differently. They were evidence. They were proof of a job well done. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt a sense of freedom. I could stay or I could go. The choice was finally mine. 1 year can change everything. A year after the reading of the will, the old house was sold. I walked through its empty rooms, one last time, a ghost of my former self saying goodbye. It held no sadness for me anymore, only a quiet gratitude for the love that had filled it. Mason, true to his word, had tried to sue. He hired an aggressive law firm and filed a suit claiming undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. It was an ugly, brutal process. He tried to paint me as a manipulative gold digger and our mother as a doddering, senile old woman. But Mom's meticulous planning held firm. The ledger, Mr. Thompson's testimony, and Sarah's sworn affidavit were an impenetrable fortress. The judge threw the case out in a summary judgment, calling it frivolous and without merit. Mason was ordered to pay not only his own exorbitant legal fees, but a portion of the estates as well. His attempt to grasp at the money had only cost him more. I didn't buy a fancy car or a new house. The money, when it finally came, felt less like a windfall and more like a sacred trust. I used a portion of it to establish something I called the Eleanor Project. It's a small nonprofit, but it's mine. We provide respite grants to family caregivers, small sums of money that allow them to hire a professional for a weekend, to take a small vacation, to just have a moment to breathe and remember who they are outside of their duties. I went back to school and got a certificate in nonprofit management. I found that the skills I'd honed as a caregiver, organization, advocacy, compassion, were perfectly suited to this new role. I was no longer Aurora, the invisible daughter. I was Aurora Vance, founder and director. I was confident. I was calm. And for the first time in my adult life, I was truly, deeply at peace. About 6 months ago, I received an email with the subject line, "Thinking of you." It was from Mason. It was a stilted, awkward mess of an apology that wasn't really an apology at all. He wrote that he and Chloe had separated, that his business was struggling, that he had made some mistakes. He blamed the stress of his job. He blamed Chloe's spending habits. He blamed the lawyers. He never once took responsibility for his own actions, for his years of neglect. The email ended with a desperate-sounding plea. I know things got ugly, but you're still my sister. Maybe we can put the past behind us and have dinner sometime. I read the email twice. The old Aurora, the one who craved his approval, might have felt a pang of guilt, a sense of familial duty. She might have said yes, but I wasn't that person anymore. I thought about the fruit baskets. I thought about the lecture on budgeting for a wheelchair. I thought about the 4-minute phone calls. I thought about my mother, meticulously logging every single slight in her ledger, not just for her sake, but for mine. She had given me more than just money. She had given me permission to value myself. And valuing myself meant not allowing the person who had so casually devalued me for decades back into my life, just because his own had fallen apart. I moved the cursor over the email. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of sadness for the brother I wished I'd had. And then I clicked delete. I didn't reply. My boundary was set, firm, and quiet. The silence was my final answer. My mother's ledger didn't just give me an inheritance, it gave me back my own life, written in my mother's hand. It quantified the unquantifiable, not for the sake of the money, but for the sake of the truth. The greatest lesson I learned was that I never needed that ledger to be worthy of respect. I was worthy all along. The ledger just forced the world and me to finally acknowledge it. Family, I've learned, isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up. It's about who sees you, who values you, and who holds your hand in the dark. Now, I want to hear from you again. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have met with Mason? Share your own stories of caregiving, of feeling unseen, or of finding your own strength in the comments below. Your stories matter, and they create a community where none of us have to feel invisible. If my story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding justice and self-worth in the most unexpected ways. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and thank you for listening. Remember that your value is not determined by someone else's inability to see it.